Alright, hello everyone. My name is Wesley. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. Today we're doing one of my favorite pantry meals, which is a rice noodle stir fry that's done, I would say, in the style of Thai food, but it's definitely not qualifying as Thai food because it is very, very pantry friendly, meaning that it doesn't have very many ingredients in it. So it kind of reminds me of a lot of like Italian pantry pastas, in which most of the things that we're going to be using are either things that you can keep in your pantry for a super long time, like garlic and ginger. We're also going to be using some Thai chilies and then broccoli, and that broccoli might be the only thing that's really actually perishable. But other than that, it's a real pantry-friendly meal, which means that it's really good if you don't know what else to cook, or if you haven't gone grocery shopping in a while. So this is one of my favorites to do on nights where I'm feeling kind of lazy. So this is the fun one. If you have any questions for me, feel free and drop your questions in the chat. I don't know everything about rice noodle stir fries or wok cooking or anything really, but I know lots of stuff. So hopefully I can be helpful or informative, or at the very least fun and entertaining to watch. I know that lots of people like to watch me just chop stuff, so that's cool too. You can also do that. That's one thing that many people do. So if you're looking for the recipe for this particular dish, that all lives over on my YouTube channel. So if you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen, which is youtube.com/woocancook. It's a fun place to be. There's new recipes. Those are coming out every Friday. And in addition to all of the recipes, that's also where we do the current live stream, which is the laptop that's behind me. On that live stream, we have nicer cameras, but also, more importantly, that's also where the schedule of everything that I'm going to be cooking lives. So if you're trying to find out what I'm going to be cooking next, that all lives over on YouTube. So lots of fun folks already watching over on YouTube. So if you haven't yet, definitely hop over to YouTube, check out what's going on over there. Lots of fun new content popping up over on YouTube pretty much every day now. So that's also where I like to do some polls. And very often I will ask folks what they want me to cook next or what they want me to do recipes next. So the one that's coming up pretty soon is a beef chow fun, which was actually a request from Paul Goldstein. He watches over on YouTube quite a bit. Paul asked for a beef chow fun, and actually a couple people have been asking for beef chow fun. So that's coming up in a couple weeks. So I often will use the poll option in YouTube to kind of ask people what they want me to cook next. So. But for today, we're doing a rice noodle stir fry that is going to be fried in egg, which is kind of, in my opinion, in the style of Thai food, because that is how Thai food very, very often will prepare rice noodles, is with an egg fried coating. So it will be rice noodles that are par cooked and then coated in egg at the very, very end. So we're going to do a couple of eggs at the very end, and that's going to be where, like, how you get the quality of rice noodle that you would generally associate with Thai cooking. So if you have ever had like pad see ew or pad kimao, pad Thai, all of those things, the way that you get to that sort of style of rice noodle is by adding a couple of eggs, so a couple of whisked and scrambled eggs. Whisked eggs, not scrambled. And then we add them very, very late, like literally at the very end of the cook time. And then when you add them at the very, very end, they sort of coat the whole dish in that egg. And that's how you end up with egg fried rice noodles. So that's probably, in my opinion, one of the most iconic qualities about Thai noodles, which is the egg coating. So I would definitely not qualify this as Thai food because it has no other qualities about it that make it Thai food except for that one preparation. But cool. So, as with many things that I cook, I'm starting off with 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic, which is what we just did. And next up is about an inch or about a tablespoon's worth of ginger. So lots of people ask me how to measure how much ginger to use. I generally eyeball it, but I usually look for about this amount, which is, I would say, about 1 inch long. Ginger is, of course, going to be really tricky to sort of like measure and eyeball because it grows in a very weird and awkward shape. So if you've ever had if you've ever bought like whole cloves of ginger, it kind of looks like this. Will generally come in a net bag, and it kind of looks in very weird oblong shapes. So that oblong shape makes it difficult to measure because it's such a weird shape. But usually what I do is I like to eyeball it. and go for about an inch's worth or maybe a whole tablespoon. Or ultimately what we're looking for is about a whole tablespoon. Sometimes I eyeball it wrong and we end up with a little bit too much ginger, but that's okay. Alright, so what I'm doing right now is I'm pulling off all of the rougher exterior skin of the ginger, so we don't want that in our wok fry because it can get chewy. If you have particularly fresh ginger, so when I have ginger that I just bought, when I have ginger that I like very, very recently purchased, sometimes I don't bother even peeling it because it's so fresh, and that's because when it's really, really fresh like that, that skin, it doesn't, it's not super chewy. But when your ginger is older, like mine is ginger is at least a week or two old, it can get kind of chewy, so you don't really want to be eating it, and it kind of ruins the texture of your ginger. So what I'm doing is I'm going for my dice first, and then once we have our rough dice, we're going to go for our fine mince just by running the knife through it. No real trick to doing a fine mince other than making sure that your knife is nice and sharp, and that's going to make things go a little bit faster. Oh, Hermina, you've heard people mention me on a few other streams. That's cool. Yeah, that's neat. Yeah, I have definitely a couple of favorite streams that I like watching. Oh, usually the streams that I watch are usually on Reddit, mostly because it's just like where I very often will find myself scrolling. There's definitely a couple of live streams on YouTube actually that I tune into on occasion, but the ones that I like, I love stopping and scrolling on our. I love Elliot's streams. He does a stream. It's called Elliot Eats. He's got a cool one, and there's another really good one. And I'm blanking on her name, but she has a really great stream that's called Let's Get Baked. That's a good one. And she bakes so much. I don't understand. She must stream like 3 or 4 times a week, and she's baking all kinds of stuff. And I don't know where are you doing with all of those baked goods. She's like making cakes and cupcakes and all kinds of crazy shit. And are you eating? That's a lot of food to eat if you're baking. The only way that I can consistently cook this often, so I cook we stream 4 times a week. But the only way that I can actually do that is because what I'm cooking is just dinner, so I have to eat dinner every night. So that's how I end up streaming so often. But I don't know how you could possibly bake 4 nights a week and keep up with that much cake consumption. That's crazy. But yeah, Hermina, that's super cool. Thank you for letting me know. That's cool. Yeah, definitely. If you haven't yet, tell your friends. Tell your friends to tune in, either on YouTube or Reddit. YouTube is probably my favorite because the picture is clear, and there's like more content on YouTube. It's not just the stream; it's actually the stream and all of like the schedules, and that's where all of the recipe videos and stuff live. So I love sending people to YouTube, but either one works. I've also heard that it looks better too. So. Alright, so next up I'm going a little bit off book from my original recipe here, and I'm chopping up some Thai chilies. So Thai chilies, I've discovered this more recently as my Thai chilies, or at least the ones that I'm using right now, have gotten older. What I've discovered is as they get older, they get more spicy. So an older Thai chili, like the ones that we're using today, these are probably like a month or 2 old now. They're some pretty old Thai chilies, probably. Eventually they will start molding, but they haven't yet. As they get older though, the capsaicin, it definitely starts maturing and it will pull out a lot more heat from it. So usually what I like doing when I have really, really fresh Thai chilies is I'll use about 6 to 8 of them. And that's right around the sweet spot of like heat that I'm looking for. More recently, because my Thai chilies have started getting older, today we're using 4. That might actually be too much even, so I might pull out some of those seeds. And that's going to give us like a nice bit of heat. But as they get older, keep in mind that you probably need to start using less and less of them. Otherwise, it's going to get really, really spicy. That's like your stepmom. She's constantly baking new things. Yeah. Yeah, gives it to the neighbors. That's usually what I would do. Most of the leftovers that I give to my brother. So I guess that makes sense. But yeah, I love baking, but I would never be able to bake that much because that's so much baked goods to eat. Cool. All right, so up next we're going to dice or like slice up some broccoli here. This is just plain old regular American broccoli. I'm going to go for fairly thin slices, so if you've watched the recipes for pad see ew, this will look somewhat similar because what we're trying to do is emulate the general shape and size of gailan, or Chinese broccoli, which is longer, thinner, and a little bit leafier. So what we're after is that shape because it's going to cook better in the wok. So if you have really large and like fat pieces of broccoli, so for example, very often in like an American preparation of broccoli, you would probably stop at this point, where it's like kind of wider, thicker, and this is probably something that you would throw into a par cook. So you would steam it, or maybe even blanch it and boil it and blanch it. In this particular wok fry, we're not going to do any par cooking, so there will be no boiling, there's no steaming, nothing like that. So since there's no par cook, we're going to be relying on the entire wok fry to cook this whole thing, which means that it has to be sliced fairly thin, otherwise it's not going to cook all the way. So you'll notice almost every piece of broccoli, unless it's really, really small, I'm going to chop it in half, and then in some cases I might even chop it even smaller than that. And what we're after is it generally trying to replicate the size and shape of a piece of gailan, which is long and thin. So yeah, if you've ever had broccoli in any kind of Chinese food, you will generally find that it is very rarely par cooked. So in American cuisine, or really like most European cuisine too, most of the time when you're working with a piece of broccoli like this, you would find it par cooked. So it would be cooked in some kind of blanch. Usually, oftentimes it would be done in like steam, or sometimes it would be boiled, something like that. Any kind of more aggressive cook where we're going to really like cook off the rawness of the broccoli. In Chinese food, you very, very rarely, or at least in wok cooking in general, I could even say, you very rarely will find that the broccoli is going to be par cooked, because if you par cook it and then you throw it into a wok, it's probably going to end up mushy. So you're going to have like mushy broccoli, and that's because it will like sort of break down the like cell structures of what makes it crunchy. So what we're looking for actually is not like fully cooked broccoli. In the same way like when we cook any other kind of veggie in a wok fry, we're not looking for fully cooked, like hard cooked broccoli or veggies or onions or bell peppers, stuff like that. What we're looking for is mostly raw. We want it mostly to be raw, with like a very, very flash cooked quality to it. So it's mostly raw, but also like mostly like crispy and crunchy. So we're going for that quality with our broccoli today. So I'm just going to give this a quick wash. And that ought to do it. Someone asked yesterday, actually, I think that was yesterday, about how to avoid flame-ups on your wok, which happens, the flame-up will happen pretty much any time an excessive amount of water, like this, is introduced to really, really hot oil. So what it means when you see a flame up in a wok is that there's too much water in whatever you're throwing in. So very, very often for me, those flame ups, they tend to happen anytime that I don't shake out enough of this water. So super, super important anytime that you're working with a veggie, especially one that you just washed like this one. So I just gave this a thorough wash in my sink, which means that there's a lot of water in it. So we want to shake out all of that water, or as much as you possibly can. If you're really thorough about it, you could probably get a paper towel out and stuff. I usually don't bother. But we want to get as much of this water out as we possibly can. Otherwise, when we go and throw it into the wok, it's going to end up blowing up. It's going to be really, really, it's going to flame up really, really hard, and that's not going to be a good thing. It will look really fancy, but it's not actually a good thing. We're going to need it later. Okay, so that's our broccoli. I'm going to set this aside, and we're going to add this to our wok. That's going to come in pretty early. All right. Next up, let's get to our chicken, actually, so we can get it marinating. Usually I like to leave my chicken very, very last so I don't have to clean my cutting board, or don't have to clean it as thoroughly as I normally would. Today we're actually going to get to it relatively early so that we can get a quick marinade in on it. what we're essentially going to be doing, our marinade is going to be pretty basic. It's mostly just going to be soy sauce and a little bit of white pepper. But the longer that you can leave it in that marinade, the more flavor it will develop independently. I'm going to get to it a little bit earlier than we normally would. What we're going for is just like any other noodle stir fry, is we're going for relatively thin strips of chicken here. So what I just did is I just did some slices down the center. And what I'm going to do is going for like thin strips. So we're going on a diagonal on that thin strip of chicken that we just did. And we're going for relatively thin strips. So that's going to flash cook really, really well in that wok heat. So one more time. I'm keeping it parallel, and then I'm just kind of giving it a slight diagonal cut here. And that's going to give us these really, really thin pieces of chicken. So those are going to work really, really well in our flash cook. So this is, I guess I should also mention, what we're using today, this is chicken thigh, which is definitely going to be my preference for this dish. Mostly because it's already a very lean dish. There's not a lot going on in this dish. It's mostly just broccoli and rice noodles, which means that there's not a lot of fat going on anywhere. So anytime that you find that I'm doing a dish where there's not a lot of fat involved, I'm probably going to try my best to involve either bacon or sometimes I'll use bacon, but most of the time I'll use chicken thigh because chicken thigh has a lot of extra fat, which you can actually see right here. This is all fat right here. And then it's kind of spread throughout all of this. This is all chicken fat right here. So when we go and throw that into our wok fry, that's going to render out into liquid form. And that's going to help us build like a thicker and more cohesive, like, not sauce, I don't want to call it a sauce, but like stir fry. It's going to be thicker because of the involvement of fat. So I have done this with pretty much every kind of protein that I can think of. I've done it very often with chicken breast. I've also done it with tofu. I think the original recipe that I had written uses tofu. All of them work, but generally when you're not working with a little bit of extra fat like this, you're going to end up with a slightly drier stir fry. And that ought to do it. Okay, so that's our chicken thigh. Now, before we clean our board, I'm going to do a quick marinade here. So we're not going to get super fancy with this marinade because I mostly stand by the fact that this dish is really, really simple, so I don't want to overcomplicate things. I actually love how simple this dish is, so I'm going to keep it fairly simple. So this is going to be 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, which I noticed recently is not low sodium, but if you can get your hands on it, low sodium. And then followed up by about a 1/4 teaspoon, maybe 1/2 teaspoon of white pepper. White pepper, if there's one thing that I'm going to use in a marinade, is usually white pepper, because white pepper has a combination of a couple of things. Obviously, it has white pepper in it, but usually, depending on where you get it, but usually white pepper will also have a couple of other things. Very often, it will have salt in it, but most often, it will have MSG in it. And that MSG is going to give us a little bit of extra umami and like a little bit of extra flavor boost that works really, really well in sort of infusing flavor in a marinade because it's so thin and fine. Which works like a little bit better than if you were to use like a fresh cracked pepper, which doesn't quite infuse as well because it's so large. So I love using fresh cracked pepper for like finishes. So like when I'm like finishing a pasta, I love adding it to carbonaras, which you're technically not supposed to do. But anything as a finish because it has a little bit larger of a grain, so it has more texture to it. All right. Yeah, let's do these eggs before I wash them. All right, last thing that I'm going to do before we wash this cutting board is a couple of eggs. This is just 2 eggs that we're going to whisk up, and then we'll wash the cutting board. I mentioned this earlier too, but what we're essentially going to be doing is adding these eggs super, super late. So these are literally going to be the very last thing that we add to our wok fry. And what's going to happen is we're going to add them right after we add the rice noodles. And that's going to coat those rice noodles in egg, and that's how you get an egg-coated rice noodle, which is probably, if you've ever had Thai food before, it's probably the quality of noodle that you associate with Thai food. So if you've ever had pad Thai or pad see ew, drunken noodles, pad ki mao, anything Thai that has a rice noodle involved, it probably has some form of egg that's added towards the end to coat it. All right. So that's actually the bulk of our prep. I guess we could do this sauce off heat first too. I'm going to add one more thing off heat. So this is going to be our sauce, which again you'll notice is very, very simple. This is going to be 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, followed by 2 tablespoons of sambal olek. Both of these are 2 of my favorite things to keep in a pantry. Soy sauce, obviously, because it goes in pretty much all wok cooking, except for Thai cooking, actually. And sambal olek because it's a really, really fundamental heat element that I love having on hand. I'm not even going to bother really tasting this because we're pretty much going to be going by taste as soon as we start cooking. So normally I would taste it and kind of adjust to season with a little bit of salt. But in this case, I don't actually think it's going to benefit much because we're really just going to end up cooking the taste in the wok. All right. So last up, we're going to measure out, this is going to be 12 ounces of rice noodle. We're going with dry pantry-friendly rice noodles here. If you don't have rice noodles, actually this probably will only work with rice noodles. I have done this with fresh noodles though. You can get fresh like pad Thai noodles that will also work. Today we're just using the regular old rice sticks. So you will frequently find these rice sticks that kind of look, they come in various different sizes and shapes. Today we're using relatively thin ones, mainly because this was the kind that I could find. But I love keeping rice noodles on hand because they are very, very pantry friendly. You can keep dried rice noodles in your pantry for pretty much forever, I feel like, and it will keep for a very, very long time. So I don't think I've ever kept rice noodles in the pantry for that long. But as far as I know, they won't ever really go bad because they're dried. Unlike fresh chow fun or fresh rice noodles, which go bad very quickly, within a couple of days. No more than 2 days. Usually by the second day, it's too stale to cook. And that is the downfall of fresh chow fun that I have run into on more than 5 occasions. At least 5 occasions. All right, so what I'm looking for here, this is going to be 12 ounces of rice noodles. If you're keeping track, 12 is not a great number to measure out for a recipe because it means that you're going to have usually usually noodles in general. This includes pasta too, but usually those noodles, they're going to come measured out in packs of 16 ounces. So very, very often, you will come across recipes that will call for either 8 ounces or 12 ounces of rice noodle, or 8 ounces or 16 ounces of rice noodle. The reason that it does that is so that you can use 8 ounces of rice noodle and then save the other 8 ounces for the next time that you make the dish. So if you ever come across a noodle dish that calls for 12 ounces, it's going to be kind of obnoxious because you're going to end up with an extra 4 ounces of noodles somewhere, like what we're doing today. But I actually think the more that I've made this recipe, I know for sure that the original recipe that I had written calls for 8. And the more that I've made it, the more that I've discovered it's not enough rice noodles. You need 12, I think. But do what you got to do, you know. Okay, so as with pretty much all Asian noodles, what we want to do here is we don't want to cook this like we would dry fettuccine or dry pasta, really any kind of Italian pasta, where you throw it in a big old stock pot. You get a stock pot rolling with rolling boil, then you salt that pasta water, and then you throw the pasta in. And then it has like a cook time 8 to 10 minutes, and you sort of toss it around. That won't work with Asian noodles, especially rice noodles, because rice noodles are very, very delicate. So if we were to do that with rice noodles, what would happen is it would probably overcook within a couple of minutes. So it would probably end up overcooking in like 2 minutes, probably less than that. It would probably end up overcooking before then. So all we really need to do, you'll notice that the noodles are actually starting to become tender already. So all we really need to do is give it a little bit of water and let it soak for a little bit. So for the first, usually when I do these, what I like doing is agitating it for the first couple of minutes. So usually the first like 5 minutes or so. I like to give it a little bit of agitation just to make sure that nothing sticks together. And then once things start to sort of pull apart and it starts to look like noodles, then we're kind of out of the woods of it kind of sticking together, and we can sort of just let it sit aside. And then we'll let it sit for another like 5-10 minutes, and it'll be ready to go. Oh yeah, good question. Yeah, Hermina, yeah, 2 tablespoons of sambal olek. Sambal olek is very, very heavy. The only reason that I think 2 tablespoons will work is because we're doing it in large quantities. So this is probably enough to serve 2, probably close to 3 people with 12 ounces of rice noodles. So it will generally be okay. But although I do agree, it is a very spicy element. So yeah, but that's true though. If you're particularly averse to spice, then I would hold off and maybe use a little bit less of that sambal olek. This needs more water. But yeah, I love having sambal olek on hand. It's one of my favorite like spice elements to keep in the pantry. I have like a couple of favorite spice elements. Sambal olek is probably one of them. That and dobanjang, which is like I guess the equivalent in Chinese food, which comes from the fermentation of chili peppers, and gochujang, which comes from Korean food, same concept. So what I've discovered is like that concept exists in various Asian cultures across many different cultures. So in Chinese food, you will find a fermented chili paste called dobanjang, which is essentially hot sauce, like our chili sauce. In Korean food, you will find gochujang, which is similar. It's Korean chili paste, which is like a little bit sweeter because of the way that it's prepared. In Japanese food, you find miso paste, which is not actually that hot because it comes from the fermentation of soybean. And then in Thai food, you have sambal olek, which I think is super interesting. So once our noodles, they start kind of breaking apart. At this point, they pretty much look like they're cooked, but they're not cooked. Once they kind of have that texture of cooked noodle dough, we can let this sit, and it will kind of cook on its own if we just let it sit for a while. I'm going to give this maybe 5 minutes, and it'll pretty much be done cooking. We do want to make sure that we're agitating that for the first 5 minutes or so to make sure that it doesn't clump together, which I have made the mistake of doing. And it sucks because then you end up with a big old clump of rice noodle, which is not fun. All right, so I'm moving over to the stove. I just started my fire on the stove, and we're going to get this thing heated up, and we'll be ready to start cooking. Yeah, gochujang, yeah. Nemo, yeah, gochujang. That's one of my favorites. Gochujang. It comes from the fermentation of chili, and it's a little bit thicker. It's much sweeter than. I would say that gochujang is definitely sweeter than dobanjang, and it is for sure sweeter than sambal olek because it has quite a bit of sugar involved, sugar that's derived from, I believe, the fermentation. That's also coming from the fermentation of chili peppers, which is really interesting. Pix, do I boil the water? Yeah, so the water is boiled, so it's boiled water. I just do it in my gooseneck kettle, which is the same one that I use for coffee. And then we're just pouring it over the rice noodles and then agitating it in a bowl. After that, you can pretty much just set it aside and it'll cook on its own. Once you just let it soak for a little bit, it will cook on its own. And that's going to be like aggressive enough to cook it through over a shorter, decent amount of time. It's probably going to take about 10 minutes in total, but it's not so aggressive that it's going to overcook really, really quickly. So if you were to try to do that in a stock pot, the same way that you do like spaghetti or fettuccine, it would overcook within like a matter of minutes. So probably in under 2 minutes it would be overcooked. All right, so I'm getting my wok nice and hot. You'll notice that there's lots of smoke billowing off, which is a sign that we're almost ready to go. Once you start seeing smoke popping off, that's generally a sign that the wok is getting really, really hot. I usually like to let it go for a couple minutes past that point, so that we know for sure that we have a ripping hot wok. Hermione, oh yeah, you love spice, but use it sparingly. Totally, yeah. Sambal, like, I guess I've been eating sambal like for so long that it doesn't really catch me off guard anymore. I usually just use a lot of it. Probably the thing that I'm more afraid of with heat is the Thai chili. So I've started being really careful about Thai chili because I've been using too much of it lately. Usually I circle around like 6 to 8 Thai chilies. Today I'm circling, I think that was 4, and I might reserve a couple of them. Yeah. Oh, Courtney, you like gochujang? Yeah, gochujang is one of my favorites for sure. It comes from Korean food and probably one of the earliest ones that I was introduced to. I used to, before I could find dobanjang, I used to use gochujang as a substitute for dobanjang because they're relatively similar. I would say, the only thing I would say is if you're substituting gochujang and dobanjang is reserve some sugar because that gochujang has a little bit more sugar than dobanjang. Cool. Let's go first started. There it goes. There we go. All right, so while the wok heats up, I'll introduce myself one more time. Hello, everyone who's just tuned in. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. If this is your first time catching one of these streams, we're here streaming every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST. Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST, so we're here 4 nights a week now. If you haven't caught one of these streams before, generally cooking our way through one of the recipes that already lived over on YouTube. So this recipe was one of the very early recipes that I had released over on the Wu Can Cook YouTube channel. I think it was like maybe the second or third one, so I think that was probably back in like June of 2020. So those always live over on YouTube, so if you haven't found it yet, that's a good place to be. The recipe that we're doing right now is one that I had written that's loosely like based off of a Gordon Ramsay recipe, which does a similar thing, but it leaves out a number of things that I think are pretty important to the dish, including Thai chilies, but also like a couple of other, like the chicken marinade. It leaves out that chicken marinade and a couple other things that I think are really important. And the reason for that is I think he was trying to create like a really, really quick pantry meal. So it was like supposed to be a meal that you can make in under 10 minutes. So the things that I've added, I don't think they take up that much more time, but they kind of create a little bit more depth of flavor, and they add a lot to the dish without adding too much time to the cook time. So that recipe, it already lives over on my YouTube channel. So if you're trying to find out how to cook the things that I'm cooking, definitely hop over there and check out what's going on. There are new recipes that pop up over on the YouTube channel. That's every Friday. So this Friday coming up is going to be Taiwanese popcorn chicken. We're going to be hacking the popcorn chicken from Quickly, which is going to be super fun. That recipe is a part of a larger series that I've been doing where I've been hacking dishes from like the Chinese American cuisine and kind of taking a look at what Chinese American food looks like when it enters the American cuisine. And kind of like taking a look at what are the American qualities of Chinese American cuisine. And how do we adjust the Chinese food that we're eating in order to fit the American palate? And then very often, usually in that series, I'll do a second attempt, including this one, and I'll do a second attempt where we'll take a look at like what does it look like if we were to do it in the lens of like regular or like more traditional Chinese food. So I think in this particular version, I think the first version that I did was a tempura batter for the American. I think the American one I did a buttermilk fried chicken version for popcorn chicken, and the second version uses tempura batter, I believe. So if you haven't caught out what's going on over on YouTube, that's a fun place to be. There's also a concurrent live stream, so I see lots of folks. Ben, how's it going? Good to see you. Ben Vicini over in the YouTube chat, hanging out. Ben's a really talented drummer and songwriter. Just generally an awesome guy. Everyone say hi, Ben. All right, let's start cooking. Oh yeah, last thing I'll say is we're working our way to 2,700 subscribers over on YouTube. So if you haven't hopped over yet, if you want to help us hit that subscriber goal, we're trying to hit 2,700 by the end of March. So hop over, give it a subscribe. Pretty sure we'll hit that subscriber goal, but help us out. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, Travis. All right, so first up, going into our wok are going to be our aromatic elements, so we can take a look. These are the first three things that we're going to add. I'm going to hold off on these Thai chilies for a little bit because I don't want to bloom out too much capsaicin. We're going to be really careful with these. And what we're going to do is we're going to bloom out the aromatic qualities of these three ingredients, and then we're going to follow it up with our chicken. And that's going to be the flash cook of our three chicken elements. And then what we're going to do is employ a technique that comes up in a lot of home wok cooking, which is batch cooking. So we're going to flash cook that chicken with the aromatics. Then we're going to pull it out, and then we're going to do our second half of the batch cook, which is going to be our broccoli. And then we're going to flash cook that broccoli, and then add everything back to the wok. So what that's going to ensure is that in order to make sure that the wok doesn't have too many things in it at once, we're going to make sure, we're going to start pulling things out, and that's going to keep the temperature of the wok as hot as possible for as long as possible. So by making sure that it's never overfilled, we can make sure that we retain as much heat in the wok as possible. All right, so let's do it. All right, so I'm starting off, this is going to be about 4 tablespoons of peanut oil. Lately I've been wok frying in peanut oil, mainly just because I happened to be at the Chinese market recently and I picked up some peanut oil. If you can't find peanut oil, you could do it with anything that's high heat. I usually would be using grapeseed, which is one of my favorites. You could also do it with vegetable oil, or canola oil would work too. All right, so starting off, this is garlic and ginger going in first. Nemo, yeah, cool. Ben is over on YouTube. You can say hi to Ben. Nemo says hi. He's over on Reddit right now. Oh, but you subscribed on YouTube. That's cool. Yeah. I'm glad that people learn from these streams. It's the best that we can look for. All right, so once we start getting some fragrance from these, we're going to add our Thai chilies. Very, very important that when you add those Thai chilies, you want to reserve or make sure that your windows are wide open, because as soon as it makes contact with that oil, those chilies are going to start releasing the capsaicin that lives in those chilies, especially if you didn't de-seed them. So as soon as you add them, make sure that your windows are open, otherwise you're going to start coughing, because you're going to start inhaling that capsaicin, which is very possibly going to happen to me. Yeah, I smell it already. All right, next up is our chicken. And you'll notice that I'm going to try as best I can to reserve as much of the liquid marinade as I possibly can. I did not do a great job, but there's a little bit. And the reason that I like doing that is because I'm trying to reduce as much moisture in the wok as possible. The more moisture that we introduce to the wok, the lower the temperature is going to drop. So as you start adding more moisture to the wok, the more quickly it's going to drop. So again, this is also in an effort to retain as much heat in that wok as possible. All right. So I'm going to spread the chicken out a little bit here, and then we're going to try and get a quick sear going. So I'm going to let this go for about a minute, and that's going to do a couple of things. The first thing that it's going to do is it's going to sear the exterior of the chicken. So we're going to have a nice crispy piece of chicken from this sear. The second thing that it's going to do, though, is maybe just as important, is it's going to render all of that chicken fat, and that's going to create like a nice pool of chicken, which is really, really great, or works really, really well if you have a round bottom wok like this one, because the fat starts pulling up at the bottom. And that's going to be one of the biggest elements to how we build out the sauce and like thickness of our stir fry. So we're going to let that go. That will need a full minute and a half, maybe even 2 minutes. Keep an eye on that. Yes. During the process of the sear, you will generally, if you're like me, you're probably going to start wondering if it's burning. I promise it's not burning, or technically it is burning because that's what a sear is, but it's going to be okay. All right, so while that's searing, we can take a look at our rice noodles, which I strained right before we started cooking the chicken. And what I'm doing is, just like we did with our broccoli, I'm going to shake out as much of the water here as possible. So unlike Italian pastas, where you like saving that pasta water, because we're trying to retain some of the starch in that pasta water, we don't really need that in this case because we don't need that starch. So we want to shake out as much of this moisture as possible to make sure that, again, we're not introducing any excess moisture to our wok fry. Yeah, that's good to me. All right. Yeah, that's looking good. All right, so once our chicken is seared, it does not need to cook all the way through because there is going to be some extra cooking time going on. But we do want it to be mostly cooked through. So usually I like to go for like 80 to 90% cooked. You can generally tell from the texture of the chicken. I usually just eyeball it. But if you're not sure, you can break one open. Pick one up and break it open. So that should do it. Let's have a look at our chicken. Alright, so I'm pulling out my chicken right now, and as you can see, it is pretty close to being done. I would say it's not quite done. I'd say that's like 90–95% cooked through, mostly just seared. We don't need this to be fully cooked because it's going to continue cooking at the very, very end once we add things to combine. But we do want it to be mostly cooked through because that's going to help us make sure that we don't end up with like mushy chicken. So we don't want to be doing the bulk of the cook during the time when everything is in the wok, because if you do that, then things will start getting mushy. So this is what we call in Chinese cooking, or in wok cooking in general, the process of batch cooking. So what we're doing is we're removing the first element that we just cooked, so that was our chicken and our aromatics. And next up, what we're going to do is wipe down our wok, so super important. Don't leave any of this stuff behind because it will absolutely start burning if you leave it behind. And then we're going to start cooking all over again. So you could even take a look. This is everything that I just wiped off. There we go. It's all this black stuff. That's all burnt stuff that's going to come off. If you leave that behind, it will absolutely get into the rest of your stir fry. And then you'll have things like burnt garlic and burnt chilies, probably some burnt chicken fat, all of the things that we don't want to introduce to the wok fry. So it's kind of a bummer because essentially what you're wiping out right there is a bunch of flavor. So you're wiping out chicken fat, which is really, really important. But we don't want to leave that behind because it will start burning. All right. All right, so next up, what I'm doing is I'm letting my wok reheat here before we start cooking on it again. Super, super important. We don't want to just start cooking on it immediately because the wok won't be hot enough. So since we rinsed it off, it will have lost quite a bit of heat. So, excuse me. Since woks are so thin, they have very, very poor heat retention. So if you were to do that with a cast iron pan, if you were to rinse a cast iron pan off, the cast iron pan would probably still be pretty hot when you put it back on the stove. And that's because cast irons have really, really nice heat retention. So even if you were to rinse it with cold water, it would still be pretty hot because they're so thick. Carbon steel wok, on the other hand, does not have a thick bottom in the way that cast iron pan does, which means that if we were to start cooking on it right after we rinsed it, it wouldn't have enough heat because you would just rinsed it down. So before we start cooking on it, very, very important is you want to reheat that pan before you start cooking again. So just like before, we're looking for some nice smoke coming off, which is all of this stuff. That's very, very important. And then we're going to give it another 4 tablespoons of peanut oil. And then in Chinese cooking, we call this a long yao, which is the process of adding cold oil to a hot wok. That gives us our non-stick surface. And then next up is our broccoli going in first. And we're going to flash cook that. We don't need it to be fully cooked. We're not looking for fully cooked blanched chicken, blanched broccoli as you would. I can't think of another broccoli dish right now. But just like any other vegetable stir fry in a wok, what we're just trying to do right now is really just cook off some of that rawness. So we don't want raw broccoli, but we want broccoli that's just past raw. So once it reaches that point, then we're ready to go, and we can add things back. So if you've ever had like wok fried veggies, or a wok stir fry that has veggies in it, that's the quality that you're looking for. Is when you eat those wok veggies, the veggies that you're eating, they're not raw, but they're like just past raw. And that's like the general quality that you would associate with wok veggies, because they're cooked for a very, very brief time. So this will probably go for like 2 minutes, maybe even less than that, on extremely high heat. So that's like searing the exterior, so it's just past raw. But after that, we're not really going to cook it too much. Yeah, that's looking good. I'm going to let that go for, that will take maybe another minute, and then we'll be ready to move on. Cool. Hello to everyone just tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. If you haven't caught one of these streams before, we're generally cooking things that are recipes that already live over on my YouTube channel. So if you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen, which is youtube.com/WuCanCook. Lots of fun content coming up over there, including new recipes. Those come out every Friday. The particular dish that we're cooking right now is a recipe that came out over on my YouTube channel that was almost a year ago, maybe probably like half a year ago now. So that was one of the very, very first recipes that I released as a part of that series. That recipe was, I think I originally had done that for a gift recipe video a long time ago. So if you haven't checked out what's going on over on YouTube, that's a good place to be, because there's lots of fun stuff coming out over there. Those new recipes, those are out every Friday. There's also a whole schedule of my live streams, which we're doing Monday through Thursday, and that has a fun schedule over on YouTube. So if you want to find out what I'm going to be cooking next, that's a good place to be. Is the wok chicken just past raw? No, the chicken is fully cooked, but that is why we did a sear, though, is to kind of crisp up those edges. I think our chicken is probably like 95% cooked, so there's maybe a little bit of cook time left, which is going to go in right now. All right, so I'm adding my chicken, and then next up are my rice noodles going in. And then I'm going to follow that up with our sauce, and I think I'm going to add a little bit of water to sort of start breaking some of this down. Alright, so I'm adding, that was maybe a 1/4 cup of water, maybe a little bit more than that, because I like my rice noodles to be a little bit looser than they currently are. Yeah, that's doing it. Yeah, that's looking good. And that you'll notice, so the main thing that you'll probably notice is that as soon as you add that rice noodle to the wok, all of the sizzling in my wok stopped happening. So that's a sign that the temperature in the wok just disappeared. So you don't have high heat anymore when you start hearing that wok kind of simmer, so it's sort of like a simmer in a wok. That's a bad sign if you're still cooking. So if you're still cooking something, if you're still trying to cook broccoli or chicken or something, and you hear that happen in your wok, that's generally a sign that you're on your way to a very, very mushy stir fry. So we don't ever want that to happen while we're still cooking. In our case, we're pretty much done, so there's not much else left to cook. At this point, the last thing that we're going to add is our eggs, and then we're pretty much just seasoning to taste from there. So it's not a big deal for us because we're done cooking. But if you're still cooking and you hear that happen, you're in big trouble, and you probably took a wrong turn somewhere. All right, so last up, that's my eggs going in. And I mentioned this earlier, but we're adding those very, very last. And that's going to give us that nice egg-coated rice noodle quality. And eggs are very delicate, so we'll pretty much cook in residual heat, but I am going to give it a little bit of time on the heat to sort of set. So they'll probably like 60% set in the wok, and then the remainder of the egg setting is going to happen off heat. So it will carry over cook quite a bit. Yeah, Fast Eddie. Oh, cool. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the upvote. That's cool. Yeah, thanks, Eddie. Flick of the wrist, yeah, that's the wok toss, it's all in the wrist. That's why it's also super, super important for woks to be pretty light, because otherwise you're not going to be able to toss it with your wrist. So in my experience, that's like the biggest problem that I ran into when I had a cast iron wok, which was really great for heat retention. So I used to use that cast iron when I was cooking on an induction top. Was really useful. But it must have weighed, that thing probably weighed like 35 pounds. So. You could not toss that thing. Yeah. There was no tossing involved in that cast iron wok. Alright. That might be just past, but that's okay. Alright, so our eggs that's probably a little bit more set than I'd like them to. Probably at like 90% set, but that's okay. And then the very last thing that I want to do is season to taste. Mine needs a little bit of salt and actually a little bit more soy sauce. So I mentioned this earlier. I was not particularly involved with tasting the sauce for this one. That's mainly because I knew that I would pretty much be seasoning to taste at the end here. So. Alright, so I'm adding that was a little bit of kosher salt, and then I'm going to add a little bit more soy sauce here, and that should pretty much do it. Yeah, that's perfect. All right, so I probably should have pulled this off a little bit earlier, but that's going to be okay. But also pretty important to keep in mind for your own attempts is that you want to pull this off a little bit before the wok or the eggs start setting, and that's because they're going to carry over cook quite a bit. So usually I like to pull these off when the eggs are still like maybe only 80% set. I think these eggs at this point are pretty much completely set. Well, probably like 90% set. It'll be okay, but just the thing to keep in mind that when you're adding eggs to a wok fry is that they're going to carry over cook quite a bit because eggs are very, very delicate. So you want to account for your cook time to account for that carryover cook. All right, so the very last thing that we're doing here, same thing that we do with pretty much every wok stir fry that I have ever done, is we're cleaning the wok. So super, super important. Anytime that you're cooking in a wok, is clean it while it's hot. That's really, really useful because while the wok is hot, it's mostly still pretty non-stick. So there's a couple of things that are stuck to my wok still. That's mostly egg because the egg is seared. That's all. If you have stuff that's still stuck to the wok by the time you finish rinsing, usually what I like doing is giving it a little bit of a scrape with the wooden utensil that I'm cooking with, and that's going to be gentle enough to, or aggressive enough to scrape most of that stuff off, but gentle enough not to scrape off our seasoning. So super, super important. We don't want to get into the world of scrubbing because you're going to end up scrubbing off the seasoning of the wok. And that seasoning is probably the most important part of the wok, because that's what makes the wok non-stick. So last thing that we're going to do, just like we do with cast iron pans, is we're going to add a little bit of oil and then just coat the whole pan with it, or coat the whole wok with a little bit of oil. That's going to prevent any kind of carbonizing. And that's it. Cool. So I don't have any, but if you happen to have any kind of fresh greens, that always will garnish really nicely. I love garnishing this with a little bit of chives, which I'm out of. Or if you have cilantro, fresh cilantro works really well. I happen to be out of both of those things. So today we're just eating it without garnish, but it will be okay. Cool. Let's give this a taste. Yeah. This is easily one of my favorite pantry meals. Probably one of the quickest meals that I know how to cook for dinner, at least. This and carbonara are probably the two things that are like one of my favorite pantry dishes because it involves very, very few things that you have to go out and buy. So if you have some broccoli and eggs in the fridge, you can pretty much keep the rest of these things in your pantry. Even I would, oftentimes I would consider eggs a pantry ingredient because of the things I just generally always have in the pantry. Or in the refrigerator at least. That and broccoli actually, so very, very often this is one of the dishes that I'll throw together if I don't know what else to cook. Super, super interesting in profile and flavor. A lot more than where the original like Gordon Ramsay recipe was, which I believe he actually did like in a non-stick skillet, which is a big no-no for me. So if you, let me know if you give this one a try. It's one of my favorites. And it is very, very simple if you have some broccoli and eggs. Cool. Yeah, Brian, thank you. Nemo, yeah, thank you. Cool. All right, thanks everyone. If this is your first time catching one of these streams, we're here streaming every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST, and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST, so Monday through Thursday. And new recipes, those are coming out over on my YouTube channel every Friday. So if you haven't caught what's going on over on YouTube, there's new stuff that comes up over on my YouTube channel every Friday. So this coming Friday, or last Friday, we released the recipe for a Japanese white miso curry, which is one of my favorite curries. That's a curry that I've been kind of tweaking for quite a while, and is largely inspired by a curry that you can find here in the San Francisco Bay Area at a cafe called Bazaar Cafe, which is one of my favorites. Their curry is a local legend. It's like known all over town as like one of the best curries that you can get in town, or like best homemade-esque type of curry that you can find. So that curry, that recipe is an homage to that version. The recipe that's coming out this Friday is going to be a Taiwanese popcorn chicken, which is inspired by Chinese American, or I guess that's like Taiwanese. That might even just be from Taiwan straight up, but definitely Taiwanese American here. Like snack spot called Quickly, which is mainly known for their boba, but they also have really good snacks, including a popcorn chicken. That's coming up this Friday, so in 2 days. What else? Those new recipes that are coming up every Friday, the Taiwanese popcorn chicken is part of a larger series that we've been doing, where I've been recreating a lot of like classic Chinese American foods that come from places like Panda Express, P.F. Chang's, things like that. Places where like the things that you're eating, they're not actually Chinese food, they're pretty much just American food. But they're like really interesting like representations of what Chinese food looks like in America. Like, how Chinese food was adapted to fit the things that Americans want to eat. So very, very often we'll do things like General Tso's chicken, honey sesame chicken, kung pao chicken. We even did the Mongolian beef from P.F. Chang's. All of those things are really, really interesting because very, very often when I hack those recipes, I find myself adding a lot of sugar and like turning the dial all the way up on sauces because those are the things that Americans love to eat. And usually in those videos, I'll do a second version where I'll attempt to remove those American qualities and replace them with ingredients that come from traditional Chinese cooking. So the General Tso's chicken, that was one that we actually released on gift recipe a couple days ago. And what I ended up doing is I pulled out a bunch of the brown sugar in that recipe and replaced it with some black bean sauce. So some spicy black bean sauce, which comes from traditional Chinese cooking, more commonly found in a dajiao mian. And I added that to a General Tso's chicken. We got a really, really interesting dish. Probably a style of General Tso's chicken that you probably will not come across. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely hop over to YouTube, check out what's going on over there. Those new recipes, they're out every Friday. There's also a fun concurrent live stream that's happening behind me. That all lives over on YouTube. So if you want to find out what I'm going to be cooking next, there's also a nice schedule over on YouTube. So you can look that up too. Cool. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free and drop your questions in the chat. Oh yeah, Hermina, that's a good one. Yes, someone asked me about that too. How to use chopsticks. So I might be the wrong person to ask because I don't think that I use chopsticks properly. But that's also because I don't use a pencil properly. So someone had asked this earlier too. But usually I think what normal people do is they write with a pencil like this. So these 3 fingers, and they write like this. When you use a chopstick, it's really that. It's just that style of pencil holding, and then you catch a second stick like this, and then we're just grabbing stuff like this, and that's how you do like really fine stuff. I do not use a pencil properly, so I usually keep my pencil on my 3rd finger, and I use a pencil like this, which I don't think is how you're supposed to use chopsticks or pencils, which means that I also don't use chopsticks properly, so I use chopsticks like this, and then I just like kind of operate the chopstick from here. Most often, I think probably the biggest most important thing that you can know about chopstick use is that most of the time when Chinese people are using chopsticks, it's not about this function, it's about this function, which is why usually when you see Chinese people eating, they will probably have like a rice bowl and they'll be shoveling stuff into their mouths like this. So this is how you very often will be eating Chinese food, which is why it's super, super important to be eating food out of a bowl, which you'll very, very rarely will see a Chinese person trying to eat food off of a flat plate because you can't pick the plate up, which means that you're not going to be able to eat it with chopsticks. So most often if you do see someone, a Chinese person eating with chopsticks on a plate, they'll probably put stuff on the plate and then like from the family style like dish, add it to the plate and then add it from there to your rice bowl in like portions at a time. But it's really, really important to be able to pick this bowl up, otherwise you're not going to be able to eat with chopsticks. So super, super often if you see me plate something and it has chopsticks on it, but it's on a flat plate, I'm probably not going to eat it with chopsticks. I'll probably just remove the chopsticks and eat it with a fork. And I probably just added the chopsticks because they're really pretty. So This might be the case. I probably will eat this with the chopsticks, but this is definitely a dish where I very, very often, because the bowl is so large and you can't pick it up, I'll probably just end up eating with a fork. So yeah, if there's one tip I can give to people who don't know how to use chopsticks or are really bad at using chopsticks, is stop trying to use chopsticks on a flat plate, because it's not going to work well. You're going to have a lot of trouble eating with those chopsticks. And then I have definitely seen in other cultures, like Korean culture and definitely Japanese culture, where they use chopsticks on a flat plate and pick up stuff like one piece at a time from that flat plate. And I don't understand how that's done. I don't know how they do that. The only way that I know how to do it is the Chinese way, which sometimes people stare at me when I eat in Korean restaurants. So that's the only way that I know how to use chopsticks, is by picking the bowl up. So. Yeah, Charles B. asked. That was it. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, Nemo. Yeah, thank you. I'll see you later. Ooh, chef Wu, I'm definitely not a chef, but I appreciate the term. Not a chef, just the guy that cooks. All right, thanks everyone. We'll be back tomorrow. We are cooking. I forgot what we're cooking already. Tomorrow, we're cooking Westlake soup. That's happening tomorrow. So stick around. We're going to tune in tomorrow, and we're going to do another soup. 6:30 PST tomorrow, and we're cooking Chinese Westlake soup, which is like a really fancy egg drop soup. So, all right, thanks everyone. I'll see you soon. Hop over to the YouTube if you haven't yet. We're working our way to 2,700 subs. So if you haven't helped us or haven't checked out what's going on over there, hop over and sub. Lots of fun stuff. All right, I'll see you soon.
I'm in love with the shape of you. One weekend, we let the story begin. We're going out on our first date. You and me are thrifty, so go all you can eat. Fill up your bag and I fill up your plate. We talk for hours and hours about the sweet and the sour and how your family's doing okay. And leaving, getting a taxi, kissing the backseat, tell the driver make the radio play. And I'm singing like, girl, you know I want your love. Your love was handmade for somebody like me. Come on now, follow my lead. I may be crazy, don't mind me. Say, boy, let's not talk too much. Grab on my waist and put that body on me. Come on now, follow my lead. Come on now, follow my lead. I'm in love with the shape of you. Push and pull like a magnet do. Although my heart is falling too. I'm in love with your body. Last night you were in my room. Now my bed sheets smell like you. Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with your body. 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 Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with the shape of you. Come on, be my baby. Come on. 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 Leave it with the babysitter, mama.